Hi everyone, welcome to our second session of the Deep History and Science in Conversation series. This is an initiative of the ANU's Research Centre for Deep History and the Rediscovering the Deep Human Past Laureate Program under W.K. Hancock Professor of History Anne McGrath. These sessions have been curated by myself and Mirjana Unikowski, who's unfortunately unable to join us today, and we're PhD students within the ANU School of History and the Research Centre for Deep History. Now, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people whose lands we live and work on at the ANU, and the country and elders of First Peoples across the continent and indeed around the world. Sovereignty was never ceded in the country we call Australia, and colonisation remains an ongoing process and lived reality for this land's Indigenous peoples. I acknowledge that fact, along with the fact that as an Australian citizen, I directly benefit from their dispossession, while as a researcher in the field of Aboriginal history, I benefit from the resilient strength and endurance of Aboriginal cultures, both in the present and through deep time. Cultures from which we can and must learn if humanity is to exhibit similar endurance in the face of the human-induced climatic and ecological threats that we're here to discuss today. Now, in our inaugural webinar, I referred to history as arguably the most promiscuous of disciplines, extending its epistemic reach into almost all fields, methodologies, frameworks, and disciplines. With this in mind, what counts as history and the historiographies that have emerged from this kind of question have always been far from straightforward. Increasingly, historians have begun embracing agents and timescales well beyond what was traditionally considered part of the professional historian's métier, opening their inquiries into areas concerning medicine, science, the environment, and deep or big time. The accompanying interdisciplinarity and intellectual collaboration that has grown alongside these new historiographical enterprises is the context in which Mirjana and I have put together this series, which we call the Deep History and Science in Conversation series. We aim to unite scientists and historians, once a month at the very least, in conversations on a given topic. In doing so, we consider this series our small contribution to a larger interdisciplinary conversation, a conversation that in these troubling times seems more important than ever, as the need to adopt broader and evolving perspectives on the deep history of humanity, human society, and the Earth itself becomes not only increasingly clear, but increasingly urgent. Dipesh Chakrabarty described the Anthropocene as having two intellectual lives from its inception. One, the scientific life, in which the Anthropocene represented a quantitative exploration of change in the natural world and the increasing impact on the environment of human activity. The second life belonged to the humanities, with the Anthropocene being cast as a moral or political issue. At the same time, qualitative inquiries were favoured over the quantitative, particularly regarding issues of historical responsibility and the impact of change on human society, transcending interests in the geological. In this session, we're looking to unite these perspectives in one conversation. In much the same way that we study the natural sciences, to understand our current and future worlds, equally, we study human history to contextualize our present predicaments, to understand how things have come to be as they are, and to perhaps recognize the need for change. With this in mind, we would like to bring the Anthropocene's two intellectual lives together to see what insights might be gained when considering the issue at its fullest transdisciplinary context. It's thus my pleasure to introduce to you our presenters for today. Opening this session will be Professor Alison Bashford, Professor of History and Director of the New Earth Histories Research Program at the University of New South Wales. Professor Bashford has published extensively on the history of science, in many ways representing the definition of a successful interdisciplinary scholarship. Professor Bashford's work has incorporated global, environmental, and medical perspectives, exploring evidence from both inside the traditional spheres of the historical archives to that of the natural sciences such as climatology and biology. Her recent focus on world populations has resulted in a number of publications on Malthusian theory, providing new insights into the geopolitics of the modern world. Professor Bashford has also published and talked publicly on the topic of the Anthropocene, and we're very much looking forward to hearing her perspective on the topic today. So thank you for joining us, Alison. Following Professor Bashford's presentation, we'll hear from Professor Will Steffen, a world leader in the field of climate change and sustainability. Professor Steffen's research has been at the forefront of anthropocentric thinking, spanning a broad range of fields within the discipline of Earth system sciences, with an emphasis throughout his career on global sustainability, integrating Earth and world dynamics, planetary boundaries, and of course, the Anthropocene and the future of the human-environmental relationship. Professor Steffen has embraced interdisciplinarity in research throughout his career, often working closely with humanities scholars, while also expanding the borders of his career regarding international dimensions of his collaborative research. In addition to the, Professor Steffen is currently contributing to the Earth Resilience in the Anthropocene project, and we're greatly privileged to be hearing more from him about his thinking and his research in detail today. So thank you for joining us, Will. Lastly, but by no means least, we'll hear from Professor Joan Leach, Director of the Australian National Centre for Public Awareness of the Sciences at ANU. Since the early 2000s, there's been a general consensus among scientists supporting the existence of the Anthropocene and of anthropocentric climate change. Despite this, disciplines such as history have for the most part remained remarkably, and perhaps it's fair to say stubbornly, unwilling to enter or engage with public debates on the topic of climate change, even in consideration of it as a historical phenomenon. Instead, the burden has largely been ceded to the scientific community regarding public outreach. Though the last few years are starting to see a change within the discipline of history, we're fortunate today to be hearing from Professor Leach, who's an expert on reaching and engaging with broader audiences on questions of global change and science. Professor Leach's research centers on public engagement with the sciences, medicine, and technology, and she's currently researching the role of popular science in the globalization of the field since the 1960s. She's spoken regularly and publicly on the topic of the importance of better science communication, and we welcome her perspective today on a topic that's profoundly historical, just as it is rooted in scientific discourse. And chairing our session today and acting as our kind of final historical discussant will be Dr. Julie Rickwood, the Research Centre's Project Manager and Research Associate. Julie's research includes music and the environment. She's an eco-musicologist and a dance practice that is engaged with questions of humanity's role and responsibilities, relating to climate change. Broadly, her insights into the Anthropocene come through the humanities and the arts. Once we've heard from each of our presenters, the forum will be opened by Julie to answer questions from the audience. On this note, please feel free to type your questions into the chat function at any time during the presentation, and I'll do my best to curate those as we go and then pass them over to Julie at the end so that she has a kind of curated list of topics for discussion and questions. It's our hope that this will flow fairly naturally, with your questions acting as prompts for our guests to speak more on their topics that they've presented on, and we'll invite them to engage with each other's material as well. Each guest will speak for 10 minutes, which should leave us around 30 minutes for your questions at the end. Though we are featuring these three fantastic academics, please remember that you yourselves are all as much part of this conversation as they are, and you're encouraged to ask as many questions as you would like. I think that's it. I'm just gonna stop there and jump straight over to our first presenter, which will be Alison Bashford.
Thank you very much, Joshua, and hello, colleagues. You can all hear me perfectly well? Great. So great to have this opportunity. Wonderful to speak with a really good panel like this. In some ways, perhaps I'm an odd thinker to open this discussion because my take on the Anthropocene is a little idiosyncratic, especially in a session run by your wonderful Deep Time Research Centre. And the reason for that is that it has long puzzled me why we put, as historians, we put Anthropocene and Deep Time together, because it seems to me that however, with one exception, however we date the Anthropocene, and as we all know, everybody listening will realise that that's been a long-standing object of discussion in which historians have been quite central. But if we go with what was once a conventional dating from the Industrial Revolution forward, or even the dating that is becoming more popular now with the work of John McNeill and others from the 1950s, the so-called Great Acceleration forward, either of those two datings puts us squarely in modern history, not deep history at all, even though clearly in the discussion of this new periodization, this new epoch, the Anthropocene, of course, it's a geological epoch, that's understood, but it is one that in fact sits in entirely conventional modern history periodization. So I, for one, I understand that as historians, many of us may be entering the domain of geological time for the first time, although we have to realize that there's nothing new in that. The history of geology has been, alive and well as a discipline predating our awareness or our naming of the Anthropocene. I understand that for many historians, there is a new and extremely exciting, and I understand why, engagement with geological time that does and may include deep time. What I'm still puzzled by is why the Anthropocene gets so connected to deep history so consistently. And so this was my, some of you may or may not read an article that I wrote actually quite a long time ago, called The Anthropocene is Modern History. And I still stand by the question that I that I put forward at that point, which was say we are to understand the Anthropocene as maybe a mid-1750s, maybe a 1788 industrialization moment forward, maybe a 1950s forward. The whole phenomenon of the Anthropocene, by definition, thus falls within the expertise of modern historians, not least economic historians of an industrializing and a globally capitalizing world. And so that makes, for me, the conversation between geologists and historians quite interesting, because although, and in a way, Josh, you move towards this claim again that historians are somehow doing working in a geological domain. In so many ways, I think it's the reverse, that geologists who are, as garden variety discussion and modes of thought, thinking in deep time. This is an ordinary state of being for a geologist. I presume Will would agree. But that in fact, what is new about the Anthropocene is that geologists are talking about very recent time. They're talking about a period of human history that is in fact the expertise of modern historians, those of us who look at the world from, let's say, 1750 forward. So that's the first point that I want to reiterate, actually, from an article that I wrote a long time ago. The question about why Anthropocene is about deep history, necessarily it may be, but it is more in a kind of more clear and certain way. It's actually about modern history. So that's still a problem for me, why this connection continues. The second thing I want to say to open up our conversation is flows from that. It derives from that. So if we think about the Anthropocene as a phenomenon, or an impact, an outcome, a manifestation of modern history of a world that has industrialized after fossil fuel, a world that worked from, different kind of fuels into a fossil fueled world, and that therefore drove industrialization and capitalism. One of the things that interests me is that the people, our historical actors who actually put that into operation were themselves people who were changing the very concept and possibility of time. And to unpack that just a little, what I mean is, what is entirely conventional and long-standing, but still completely fascinating about the history of conventional geological thought, that is to say, Europe outwards history of geological ideas, is completely bound up with bursting the limits of time, to use Martin Rudwick's phrase, that even as the Anthropocene commenced, let's say for the moment, mid-18th, perhaps beginning of the 19th century, even as fossil fuels started changing the world into what we have today, the very geologists who are pushing that forward are the ones who are at the forefront of thinking about how time changes from a geological, a biblical 6,000 years to first tens of thousand years and then millions of years. And so the generation that in fact implemented, so to say, the Anthropocene, did the geological research, discovered the coal, created the research that gave us Gondwana coal, for example. These are the very geologists who in their own lifetimes are experiencing and thinking through the most remarkable shift from the world being a biblical 6,000 years old to millions of years old. So for me, there is, that's a very different engagement between the Anthropocene and thinking about deep time, I suppose, than the more conventional. And I think sometimes a little, I still need it explained to me why the Anthropocene. I understand that it makes us as historians think about different scales, but why it puts us into deep time is something that I hope some colleagues and perhaps people listening can explain to me again. And so they're my 2 points. That's the first one. The second one is to me this fascinating. We all know, and especially your Deep Time Research Centre knows that when we think about time and cosmologies across the world and cosmologies within Australia, one of the things we discover, unsurprisingly, is completely different conceptions of time. One of the things I'm really interested in is how that also applies to a total revolutionizing of time actually applies to a conventional history of geology itself, as time itself expanded at the beginning, simultaneously with the beginning of the Anthropocene. So how about that for my first two openers? And I'm really looking forward to some discussion.
Thanks so much, Alison. That was excellent. I'm also looking forward to discussion in that regard. Now, moving on from there, we'll go to Will to respond and kind of present his short session, and then we'll go to Joan after that.
Right, thanks very much, and thanks for that terrific intro, Alison. I think it's a beautiful way to start the discussion. First, a disclaimer, I'm actually not a geologist. I'm an Earth system scientist, and that's quite different. Earth system science being quite recent development in the sciences. And I think a really simplistic way to put it is that the geologists study the hardware, Earth system scientists study the software of how the planet operates. So I'm going to do the usual geeky scientific thing and share my screen here and show a very short PowerPoint to give you an idea of what the Anthropocene is all about. Let's see if I can get it from a scientific point of view. Right, hopefully that's coming up now. So just in the next 10 minutes, I'll give you a bit of background on the scientific background of where the Anthropocene came from. The reference point really is the most recent geological epoch called the Holocene. And here we see a temperature record over 100,000 years, which encompasses most of the last ice age, which is this very jagged line going down deeper and deeper in temperature until the last glacial maximum. And then about a 7,000 year transition period and an 11,700 years of relative climate stability called the Holocene. And that's the only time in which humans have been able to develop villages, cities, complex technological societies, and so on. So agriculture itself developed about 10,000 years ago at the beginning of the beginning of the Holocene. But some of the data that really supports the Anthropocene is data we call the Great Acceleration that the program I was involved in, the IGBP, put this together really around the year 2000. These are the latest updates of them in 2015. So we have 12 graphs here showing what we call a human enterprise. And it's the usual thing of population, GDP, urbanization, energy use, resource use, and communication. But you see here that we began at 1750 to pick up the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But what we find is, although there's certainly increases and changes in all of these indicators, it was really the mid-20th century where the human enterprise really exploded into the world we know today. And a lot of this work has been popularized by people like John McNeill in his book, Something New Under the Sun, and so on. But for an Earth system scientist, the question is, well, what does this matter for how the Earth system operates? And the answer is indeed it does. These are 12 indicators of the Earth system. The top 6 are what we call the geosphere, the non-living part of Earth. The bottom 6 are what we call the biosphere, the living part of Earth. And again, you see changes in all of these parameters, whether it's atmospheric gases, surface temperature, acidity of the ocean, fishing, biogeochemistry, land system change. They're not quite so neatly packed around 1950 because of resilience and leads and lags and how the Earth system responds. But in all 12 of these, we can say two things for sure. One is they are outside of Holocene norms. And second of all, the major driver in all of these is human activity. It's not natural variability in the Earth system. Climate's obviously one that people talk about a lot. There's the change in global average surface temperature from when we had reasonable global records from 1880 onwards. And we see a strong shift toward much warmer conditions, particularly again since the middle of the 20th century. But to understand that in at least a little bit deeper time, this is a 2,000-year reconstruction of Earth's temperature. So this is the time of the Roman Empire, AD 0. And this last about 100-year trend of human influence, I've put this on the same scale, both in time and in temperature at the end. So you can see what a remarkable shift this is, well outside the bounds of Holocene norms at extraordinary rates. So if you compare the rates of that very slow cooling to this rate of temperature increase, it's about 170 times faster and in the opposite direction. But of course, the Earth system is far more than just the physical climate system. If we look at the biosphere, there's been a recent assessment of where we stand there, and some of the outcomes of this assessment are quite striking. Nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history. Already this puts us back into deep time. About 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, many with decades. The last time we saw figures like this was about 65 million years ago, so that puts us back in even deeper time. And the web of life on Earth is getting smaller and increasingly frayed. If we go back now in deeper time in Earth's climate history, we'll look at this the fourth panel here. This goes back nearly 70 million years in the past. And if you look at where we are going on our current trajectory in terms of climate, there are some analogies, which is why the Anthropocene may actually have some relevance, at least geologically and climatology, for deeper time. So our present trajectory would take us here to what's called the mid-Miocene climate optimum, which is a time of maybe 4 degrees warmer. And that time period was about 15 million years ago. So it's well before modern humans or even our ancestors were on the planet. But the rate at which the Anthropocene is unfolding is really, as I showed before, a spike in the climate history. The last time we saw a spike of this rate was this period here called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. That takes us back 56 million years ago. And that was a spike, again, of about 4 or 5 degrees, and then a relaxation over several 100,000 years into that longer term trend. But of course, as the name indicates, the Anthropocene is far more than the natural sciences. And there have been a lot of interesting critiques of the Anthropocene from the social sciences in particular. This is one that came out very quickly after the Anthropocene was introduced by 2 Swedish political scientists who quite correctly criticized us natural scientists of talking about mankind or humankind in general, saying it really is the less than 20% of us who are fossil fuel driven, consumption oriented economies around the planet that have really driven the Anthropocene. And they make the point that inequalities within the human side of the Anthropocene are really important parts of this entire narrative. More recently, in a book that was published a few years ago, Elizabeth Kolbe made this quite interesting comment that it may seem impossible to imagine that a technologically advanced society could choose, in essence, to destroy itself. But that is what we are now in the process of doing. And she's pointing toward one possible outcome of the Anthropocene, which could be a collapse of the society we know today. I'll conclude by jumping back into natural sciences. This was a paper that we published a couple of years ago to really try to draw a little landscape cartoon to picture where the Anthropocene is going. And so what we call this glacial interglacial limit cycle, this is the oscillation between ice ages and warm periods here. It's shown as a deep cold valley and a smaller, warmer valley. But this is the world that humans evolved into. So this is our world as a species. And of course, this is the Holocene, the most recent one, where we've been able to develop agriculture in more complex societies and so on. But the Anthropocene is arguing that since the mid-20th century, we have left the Holocene envelope of variability, that little valley, and we're out here in some no man's land of a warmer climate, but no distinct stability domain, moving at a fairly fast rate, an increasing rate toward a number of possible futures. And I've only put two of them here. These are the two that are talked about a lot. One is if we can meet the Paris climate targets and slow and then reverse biosphere degradation, we could end up in what we called stabilized Earth, which is actually not a natural state of the Earth system, as far as we can tell from natural sciences, but one that would actually have to be steered by humans into the future. The other one is the one we're on, and that's the one that's heading toward a possible planetary threshold, feedbacks in the climate system that would push us over sort of a cliff in this landscape and into what we call hothouse Earth. That's the 4 or 5 degree world that we could hit by 2100. We argue that that's actually a stable state of the Earth system. It's been in hotter states before, as I showed you, and sits there for millions of years, but it's not a very good state for large mammals like humans. So that's the dilemma of the Anthropocene. And I think, as many commentators have said, as the name indicates, we humans are now the most important driving force in terms of where the Earth system is going. So that's a quick snapshot from the natural sciences side of things. And we pose this question, which I think unites all of our disciplines. We all have something to say about this question: where on Earth are we going? So I'll stop there and turn it back over to you, Josh.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Will. That was fascinating and super enjoyable and engaging and accessible. Thank you for taking, complex scientific ideas and making them accessible for non-scientific folk, I guess I should say. Moving on from there, I'll pass straight over to Joan, and she'll speak for another 10 minutes, and then we'll kind of go to Julie for some closing thoughts and the relating of all of these concepts back to deep history, and perhaps a little bit of a rebuttal to Alison's statements earlier. Over to you, Joan.
So I'm quite humbled, actually, to share this Zoom space with Alison and Will. I'm going to try something slightly different. I'm not a historian, and I haven't done research in deep history, but what I find myself as at the moment is as a user, maybe an end user of deep historical narratives, as a way of engaging communities with both science and history. And so the best way that I can kind of bring out some of these issues, and I hope invite others to join me on a bit of a journey, is to talk about a project that is very local here to Canberra, which I'm working on with colleagues of Will's, actually, in the Fenner School, and also in RSSS at the ANU, at Mulligans Flat, which is a gorgeous place. So Mulligans Flat is quite a special place. It's a nature reserve, and the idea there is to reintroduce species that have gone locally extinct. Probably most prominent amongst those species is a very charismatic species known as the Eastern Bettong. And so those reintroductions have been made, and there have been pretty major success in reintroducing stable populations of a range of small marsupials. Now, what's interesting also about Mulligans Flat is you might think of it as a gated community for animals, in the sense that it is also a fenced preserve in the middle of a growing area of Canberra, Gungahlin, and the suburb of Casey that sort of surrounds the Mulligans Flat Nature Preserve. And so when these animals are released, they need to be protected, especially from local feral animals, especially feral cats, but also foxes. And so this makes it a very interesting sort of place. These preserves are sort of becoming more common around the world as fenced precincts where different kinds of ecological systems can thrive. Now, the interesting thing about this is that looking at the area around Mulligans Flat, there have been local extinctions since at least the 1600s of a range of animals. And so defining what makes a vibrant ecosystem for these animals is quite difficult. So when I work with Adrian Manning, who's been doing a series of experiments over about 10 years. And one of the questions he always raises is, to what degree and to when degree do you want to talk about rewilding or defining what is a local or native species? And so that becomes a very tricky question, and one that I think has a lot of interest for audiences outside the sciences. So in terms of science engagement and engaging people with questions of conservation, this is a kind of a crucial question. Now, let me just add here. So one of the issues that rises, and I think can be quite usefully framed, perhaps in a deep history paradigm, and it's a place in where ecology, I think, could learn a lot from some of the narratives coming out of deep history, is this issue about shifting baselines. So as colonization happened, and especially out at Mulligans Flat, the region was sort of degraded, and animals went into local extinction. People got used to that scenario over hundreds of years. Okay, so at the point now where we can release a few bettongs back into the environment, we're releasing them into a kind of a social context as well, where the baseline has shifted and we kind of don't have the ability to appreciate the full ecology of the region anyway. So what colleagues have been working on is a process they call backcasting, where they look at ecological epochs over hundreds, thousands, and even tens of thousands of years, and talk about the ecology over those periods, and ask people to think about what they value about those particular ecosystems. And it's a pretty big conversation to have on a Saturday afternoon outside this walled precinct, but it's been a really useful conversation to start. And those narratives, I think, can be more valuably framed with some sorts of deep historical framings and conversations. So I'll just throw out 3 questions to the group about deep history and the narratives it's producing and its relations to science communication, because there are some, I think, some quite, I don't know, perhaps difficult moments, I think, in some of the narratives of deep history. Some of them, from the view of somebody who's working in science communication and public engagement, start to look like problematic popular science. But others can be much more powerful. So this notion of backcasting, I think, is really provocative. And as ecologists use it, they think about it as an ecological technique, where they're imagining ecosystems in other times. However, I think packaged in a critical deep historical practice to help us imagine alternative ecosystems and the way we might value those at different times could be an extremely useful contribution from deep history, right? That's not a scientific question about valuing these ecosystems. It's also a question of social value. And I think putting those 2 frames together could be very useful and also of interest for people in public engagement. Second, this issue about adjusting timescales. Now, out at Mulligans Flat, we're talking about, of course, the ecology and about the species that are out there. What's really another interesting feature of Mulligans Flat is that the center of the space is a sheep shed that was brought to the space, a sheep shearer shed brought to the space in the mid-90s from a local place, and there it sits in the middle of the place. But one of the interesting things that's happened out there as the local community comes and they ride their bike and they come to see animals is that questions have been also raised about the indigenous history of the region. And just this year in April, the ACT Historical Society made made a successful appeal to have the rock quarries at Mulligans Flat seen as important historical features of the region. So what's really interesting now out at Mulligans Flat is you have these artifacts of different, quite different historical epochs sitting side by side without kind of any explanation, right? So how do we want to talk about these historical artifacts as they're in juxtaposition with with these different epochs of animals we're reintroducing? So you can see there's this complete kind of haphazard reference of all kinds of timings and of artifacts. And so this needs a story. And I think it needs some serious historical work to build that story. And I think that it's some serious communication work to build that story. Finally is this idea of going back into the past and going back into the deep past, which also brings us to be able to go into perhaps a deeper future. One of the interesting things about Mulligans Flat is it belongs to a network of other sites around the world, including Zealandia, which is an amazing place in Wellington, New Zealand, where they invite visitors to see themselves or their families or their descendants or whomever might be in Wellington in 500 years, invite them to a future imaginary, a future vision of what that space might look like. And by looking into these possible deep pasts and also different epochs and also different ecological possibilities of the past, we might be able to better imagine different ecological possibilities into the future in the same way. So actually by backcasting and the techniques of historians, we might actually be able to build better future imaginaries. Now, for somebody who is interested in engaging the public in these stories, these seem to me to be really, really important techniques that we're trying out. And so this project out at Mulligans Flat, at the end of last year, we've just advertised for 4 new PhD students to come to the ANU to work on these issues of telling histories of rewilding, exploring what the values of those of adding different kinds of animals back into the ecosystem is, and also sort of building a historical narrative of this local place, but one that I think builds relationships to many other places around the world. So that's my interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Joan. That was fascinating. And to my mind, at least, really kind of raises some of the core issues to do with what Alison was saying as well. And what I see personally as a historian as the function of deep history, which is to engage with the interplay and the interrelationship between humanity and the environment, and what has, since I guess Enlightenment thinking, we could say that there's a perceived kind of distance between nature and culture. And I see the function of deep history as removing that separation and speaking back to that and saying that humanity is actually part of the natural world. And I think in that sense, your presentation and Will's presentation were quite eloquent in stating that as a fact. And I think places like Guruyaru over in Gungahlin really raise interesting questions about how we see our relationship with the environment, and whether, conservation is this fortress approach, or, what it means to have a natural environment, and what it means to understand Australia, I think, particularly, and this is why I think deep history has a particular utility in the Australian context, because we have 60,000 years of Aboriginal occupation on this continent that suggests that what we see as wilderness or nature in Australia has a long history of interrelationship with human culture. This was a created landscape. I'll leave my thoughts and opinions there and pass over to Julie to kind of speak back to all of your presentations thus far, and then we'll move forward from there. Over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Josh. And likewise, I feel very, very humbled to be with you on this panel, Alison, Will and Joan, bringing such amazing thinking from a diversity of backgrounds into how we might approach this. And I have a presentation which I'd like to speak to, and it will certainly engage with some of the conversation that has already been going on from your presentations, and might prompt further conversation. And certainly I think it does, eventually I want to get to what Josh has just been speaking about too, about bringing the humanities and the sciences and the arts, I would think, together, that this nature-culture divide might be kind of critiqued, and that we may start to realise, and this is a conversation that Josh and I have had, that we need to, rather than think about nature, yes, who is nature? I went to a webinar recently called Who is Nature, which was a really interesting engagement with these sorts of things. But in fact, to understand that ever since humans, as Homo sapiens, we were living in a cultural landscape, and that there was always, an effect on the environment. And I think others have mentioned that today and previously, that, despite what might have been said about hunter-gatherers, how aimless their work, their meanderings were, it can be brought into question. And certainly the Australian example of that has really brought that up very, very, very much with the work of Bruce Pascoe and others. So I was just wanting to open up and thank you all very much for those very in-depth and diverse presentations that really stimulated a lot of thought for me, and particularly going to you, Alison, to begin with, and your questioning about the Anthropocene being modern history and not something that deep history might be or should be engaged with. And when the Anthropocene was nominated as the discussion for this, I then thought, well, are we talking about the Anthropocene or climate change? And I know that one informs the other, but they're not the same thing. The Anthropocene is indeed a certain geological epoch, which the name of it itself is full of debate within the humanities and elsewhere. Is this appropriate? Why isn't it the Capitalocene? Why isn't it, ecocide? There's a whole range of language around that critiques the actual name itself, the Anthropocene. And then there's climate change, which has come about through the Anthropocene, but as Will has so eloquently showed us in his presentation, climate change has happened before. It's nothing new. So what is it that we can find about human history in the past that might now help us think about how we might approach the future? And thank you very much for that, Joan. I really think that future thinking is very much something that we should be engaging with, and that this is what history can do, and deep history can do, is prompt that future thinking, because by looking on the past, it can help us possibly solve situations of the present to get to that better future that we might all desire. So just going back, so there was that first dilemma, and I had a wonderful quote from Dipesh Chakrabarty, but I'm sure you're all aware of his work, and he's been very, very vocal in this area for a long time. And then one of the things that I was going to reflect upon was that this webinar on the Anthropocene follows our previous one on pandemics, which of course, as Josh previously pointed out, was prompted by our current COVID-19 situation. And we're not alone in seeing these sort of things possibly connected, but possibly also an opportunity for discussion. And the parallels and disconnects between COVID and climate change have been very much at the forefront of many discussions I've attended just of late. And also thinkers such as Bruno Latour, where he does say this you know, this is a time of a great pause. And this great pause that we're all living through at the moment gives us time to reflect upon what changes and what is happening through the various mechanisms and things that people are doing, social practices and regulated practices during COVID, but also time to just sit and be and think and recognize, as you have done and others have done, that the threat of COVID is a very great threat, but the threat of climate change is one that is far greater. And again, as we have seen in COVID, reveals the inequities and the various ways that not everybody is affected in the same way, and nor are they responsible in the same way. One of the webinars that I attended was with Siobhan McConnell, and she said exactly, COVID is a threat to Indigenous Australians and the Pacific and people of the Pacific, but climate change is a far greater threat. And so I think these are just some of the things that I was thinking about in the readings and the preparation that I was doing for this webinar. And so my engagement with climate change in its broadest sense, well, with environmental sciences, comes from my undergraduate degree back in the 1980s. So it's been really in the human sciences program at the ANU. So it's been really interesting to reflect upon that. It's been very much punctuated in ways, but nonetheless, I revisit it from time to time. And so it's been quite wonderful to be able to do that again, and then to, you know, be part of this webinar and to hear your insights into what you know about these things as well as being very, very good. There was a provocation from Dan Smale that I was going to put up, where he said, you know, geologists are suddenly discovering history and they need historians to help them tell the story, or something along those lines. And so I thought that was an interesting provocation, and maybe you can talk some more to that provocation, because both of you, Will and Joan, have suggested that that might not be the case. And certainly, Alison, you might have something to add to that as well.
So I think, yeah, we'll open it up now then for a bit of discussion and questions from people. I think that kind of leaves us in a really interesting place where we can say that historians might have a certain ability to engage with narrative that is important for the same kind of future thinking that Joan was talking about, and that might be a way that deep history and history more generally is able to engage with the sciences and deal with the concept of the Anthropocene. I'd love to hear people's thoughts and opinions about that. I would suggest personally that I think, in response to what Alison was saying earlier about the Anthropocene as modern history, I would think the advent of the Anthropocene is a phenomena of modern history, and that's very true. But to understand what we can do about the Anthropocene, we need to move beyond that modern history and into a deeper past to understand that the ways that humanity have engaged with nature and in the environment throughout human history, which is a much deeper and rooted history than a modern history or economic history of the Industrial Revolution would allow us. So I'll leave that as my provocation and a response to Julie's reference to Dan Smale and his work, and leave it to you guys to discuss that somewhat.
Shall I come in?
Yes, please.
Josh, thank you very much to everybody, and Julie and Josh and Joan and Will. To kind of go backwards, I think that Dan Smale's comment about in a way, geologists needing historians is, you know, overstated and very useful for historians to say. Because I think that what I'm more interested in is this phenomenon that predates our discussions of Anthropocene well and truly, but the fascinating way in which geologists, and in a way, Will, I understand you're not a geologist, you're a system scientist, but in a way, people who used to call them geologists were also, it's the kind of antecedents of what you're doing. So, you know, when I say geology, I mean in a very kind of large, you know, in a way, almost an 18th century way. But the point is that geologists and historians are both experts on time. We're both experts on time as disciplines. We are both geology, broadly conceived, and history are the disciplines for whom periodization is the key fascinating question. Not all historians are taken with the phenomenon and the project of periodization. Personally, I've been fascinated with periodization from the very beginning of my career as a historian, which is perhaps why I keep on circling back to enjoying reading geologists in the past for whom periodization is also a really central question. So I see it in a way not as one needing or suddenly discovering another, but in fact there's this long, very long history of geologists and historians being the disciplines for whom time, and especially periodization, how we change, where we put the markers, where we put the thresholds, what are the criteria on which we think through those threshold moments. Of course, we're in one of those now, and it's the fact that there are very different scales on which this operates, but nonetheless there's a phenomenal and fascinating similarity in the project, is what I see. So in a way, it's quite a different response to Dan's. I just want to say quickly that also backcasting is really interesting to think through, because my backcasting, Joan, is what historians do. You know, we are professional backcasters, and in a way, it's kind of interesting to think what we do through that way. And the other thing I just want to say from our discussion is, you know, this apparent division between nature and culture that conversation continually folds back to. I, for one, would like somebody to point to me a period when people haven't thought nature and culture together. So I think this apparent divide in ways of thinking between nature and culture is mythic. I don't, even if we think in a really narrow intellectual history terms, I can't think of a time when nature and culture aren't thought together. And so I think it's kind of a device, actually, by which we think that we're doing something different now. But in fact, I don't think we are. I think that there's a long, it's something in Depeche's work that I've always been curious and misunderstood. No, I haven't misunderstood, I've actually disagreed with. So Depeche also argues that there's something particular about now, that we're understanding that nature and culture are folded together. I don't actually see that as a new thing at all. I can't think of a time when nature and culture haven't, in one way or another, been understood together. That's a completely different statement to saying, before I just anticipating queries, that's a completely different statement to saying that humans aren't responsible for the changes that have brought the current world. That's a different matter. What I'm saying is, in terms of ways of thinking, I think it's something that pretending in a way that now we're suddenly clever people who think of nature and culture as linked, simply situates us as especially clever. But in 17th, 18th, 19th, in other cosmologies, nature and culture are put together in very different ways, but I don't know when they're ever put together.
Open field for those who would like to respond. We do have some questions here, but I'll give people an opportunity to respond to Alison. Yeah, sure, Joan.
Well, I'm not sure this is a response to Alison, but rather to pick up this question about, you know, whether geologists need historians or that kind of thing. Or, I mean, I might go so far to say ecologists might. And just thinking about the project I'm working on, I mean, one of the reasons that the Eastern Betong went locally extinct, of course, is because it had a habit of digging up the local residents' potato patches. So that kind of put a little X on its back for being killed by the locals. And those are the kinds of questions that historians are very, very good at using evidence to kind of suss out, right? And where ecologists aren't necessarily looking for evidence in that space. Now, it's just a tiny little example, but if you look back over, hundreds of years of history and ecological change, there are a lot of little facts that start to make a difference for how you think about putting ecosystems back together. And so I think actually, and this isn't anything about our nature culture divide, it's more about who has domain over what kinds of historical data, and that's a problem of the academy perhaps. But I think if we can put some of these things back together, you just get a much richer story about the ecology of a region, and you have just more tools at your disposal to start having discussions about how to intervene. So I guess that's why I've become quite interested in this deep history discussion as an outsider, is that these narratives actually do seem to have purchase not only on how we intervene, but how we encourage others to think about intervening and how we tell those stories. So, so not sure about geologists needing historians, but maybe ecologists, at least local ones, feel like they do.
Yeah, let me make a comment there, which I think is quite interesting. In fact, the historians were ahead of the Earth system scientists in terms of the Anthropocene. If you put aside the word itself and just think about the concept, I showed you those 12 graphs of the human side and the Earth system side of change. And what surprised us was the inflection points around 1950. We hadn't expected that. We expected to see a smoother curve from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That's what the natural sciences expected and would have thought. It was only in the year 2000 that we first developed the first of those images at a meeting of the IGBP Scientific Committee, and that's where Paul Crutzen first used the term Anthropocene back in the year 2000. But it was a few years after that, we were at a conference where John McNeill was at the same conference. And we immediately started talking with John, and he pointed out that in 2001, he published a book called Something New Under the Sun. But in fact, he'd done a lot of the work and writing on that before the year 2000, before the Anthropocene was coined. And in that book, he points out about the remarkable nature of the 20th century in terms of human history, and the fact that around the middle of the 20th century, all sorts of things were changing at higher speeds. And so it fit almost perfectly, obviously, our narrative that had come out of looking at the physical side of the Earth system and how it was changing. So in fact, you could argue that historians had actually predated the origins of the Anthropocene, and we came in a little bit later on the Earth system side. But of course, the term, because Paul Crutzen used the term in a geological sense from the very beginning, and he used the word Anthropocene in conjunction with epoch from the very beginning. And geologists being a little bit slower, I would say, than the rest of us, it took them until 2009 before they formed the Anthropocene Working Group. So there is a lot of very interesting human history involved in the origin of the term and the concept of the Anthropocene, and indeed how the natural sciences, and we're all humans too, how we've responded in very different ways and in different timescales to what this concept is trying to say.
With that in mind, we have a question from Emily Dott, speaking, I guess, specifically to environmental archaeology and cultural geography, but asking if people are familiar with that kind of literature and what that kind of means for their perspective on the Anthropocene, and whether it prompts engagement with other ethnicities, ontologies, and understandings of the human and natural relationship. Speaking for myself, I've actually been spending quite a lot of time reading cultural geography and some environmental archaeology as well. And I think in a deep history perspective, it's absolutely essential for understanding this relationship between people and the environment over time. Whether it's backcasting in that ecological sense that Joan was talking about and trying to imagine what a landscape might have looked like in the past, or imagining how a culture understood that landscape in the past. They're two different questions, I think. Does anyone else have anything to say in regards to environmental archaeology and cultural geography and their understandings of the Anthropocene?
Josh, could I just come in there? It was one of the things that I was going to talk about as well, that our understandings of the past, and this is going into Alison's work, that it's not only ancient history that gives us understandings of the past, but it has always been archaeology and other disciplines. And I think that's what we're trying to do here in having these conversations in the research centre itself, is trying to bring all those perspectives together so that we can get, I guess, a much more layered understanding of the deep human past and the ways that we might be able to imagine the past, but also imagine the future. And that's something I was going to talk about later, but I'd like to hear you all say a little bit more about that broader engagement, both with other disciplines, but also, as Anne has also brought into this discussion, about different cultural perspectives, about the concept of time, but also about that relationship with the environment. So if you'd like to talk to that.
May I come in, Josh?
Yes, please.
Thank you. A couple of things I want to say is, one is, sometimes I think it's hilarious that historians have discovered the Holocene and the Anthropocene, and then we've discovered the Pleistocene, as well. And I just, in some ways, I want us all to be a little more, I mean, it goes exactly, but a bit controversial to the point of interdisciplinarity. We have to realize that the Holocene and the Pleistocene and way beyond was garden variety stuff for all of our colleagues in archaeology, in earth system science, in geology, and it's just that historians have discovered it lately. And so I do think it sometimes, when I speak, especially to my many friends in the archaeological field, they think it's hilarious when historians suddenly put the Holocene and the Pleistocene on the table as if it's new. And of course, this is importantly, but also just periods of time in human and pre-human history that has just been worked over in other disciplines, for many years. And so I think we need that actually, we need to hold that up. I do just want to thank Will actually for putting us in a very recent genealogy of scholarship on this matter. And I do want to say that for me, one of the things that I will often be caught saying at various meetings amongst historians is that I still think the first and arguably most important statement argument that made historians turn to what I've just described was actually the piece that you wrote, Will, Steffen, with Libby Robin, very early on in the game, very early on. And you will know the date, I can't recall off the top of my head. But I think there's a strange way in which historians and there's a strange way. We all know in our disciplines that, when we do literature reviews often solidify and then they get repeated, right? And what's happened in the history field is what has been solidified and gets repeated all the time is reference back to Depeche Chakrabarty's, and hello Depeche if you're listening from Chicago. What's solidified and is pretty rock solid, to use a geological term, is Depeche's climate of thesis, 4 theses. And it's fantastic, of course, but what predates that and what sits inside that article as a footnote to the Anthropocene, and actually the only reference to the Anthropocene, is Will Steffen and Libby Robin. and the article that, as I understand it, predates that. So I am an advocate for two things. One is thanking Will right now, because I often draw attention to your article that in some ways, unfortunately, has slipped off the standard literature review, and I think, if anything deserves to be the kind of modern origin of this discussion across disciplines, it's that one. But I also want to destabilize this kind of rapidly solidifying, if not already solidified, literature review that happens, especially amongst historians.
Excellent. Thanks, Alison. Will, did you have anything you would like to say in response to that high praise?
Just to thank you very, very much, Alison, for those comments. And I've always enjoyed working with Libby. That was one of the great joys of being at the Fenner School for a few years, was being able to work with so many people from so many different disciplines. And more generally, I think I've gotten to know Dipesh a little bit, not as well as you do, but obviously people like John McNeil and people like this. It's been fantastic working with people way outside of my discipline. And one of the nicest things about the whole Anthropocene discourse is that I've learned a whole lot more from the discourse than I think I've been able to contribute to it, because of all the different areas of scholarship that's come into this. So if anything, one of the best outputs of the Anthropocene is simply as a way of getting people across disciplines to talk to each other. And I think we learned so much by doing that. So thanks for those comments, Alison.
That's why we're here, to hopefully engage in these kind of multidisciplinary conversations to mutual benefit. Now,
indeed, and Josh, with that, some people are actually asking questions which my PowerPoint was going to lead us into. So I think I'll ask other people's questions rather than frame it in the way that I was going to. But two questions that I'd just like to read first and get the panelists' response. And then, Anne, I can see that you are there and you have asked a question, but maybe you'd like to join us at the end to ask some questions in this panel as well. But from Emma Cowell, she says, there seems to be a distinction from Alison between the potential contributions of the field of history in general and the field of history of science. Is there a distinction between these fields of history in their relationship to deep time research? Do you have any comments, Alison, Joan, or Will, to that?
Others? I've spoken a lot. I do think there's crossovers here, if I may just respond. Hello, Emma. I do think there's, what do I think about this? I think there's perhaps the Anthropocene has formed a kind of a bridge between those of us who are historians of science, or the discipline, I suppose, of historian of science and the discipline of history more generally. Perhaps it's been an area that has allowed many of us to cross over. And so that historians of science aren't as sequestered as they used to be. I think that the phenomenon of environmental history and world history and the history of science have been linked very dynamically in and around the question of the Anthropocene. But in a way, they've all got different genealogies, right? And somehow working through those is quite interesting. Personally, I think that quite conventional history of geology, which is why I keep going back to Martin Rudwick's canonical work in the history of geology, that tells us how scientists in the past have thought about layers of earth, stratigraphy, how they've invented past places and times like Gondwana land, how they, in the 1780s, 1810s, 1850s and onwards, or still thought about distant futures through their geological understanding of the earth. I still am an advocate for going back into actually quite conventional history of geology. I think we need to layer that with that kind of conventional history of science with everything that we've learned, especially in this country, from thinking through Indigenous history, thinking through settler colonial histories. For me at the moment, I'm trying to think through what it means that Hutton's foundational geographical story, The Theory of the Earth, was published in 1788. And what does it mean actually for Australian historians, for thinking about Australian history, that the foundation, the text that is understood to found modern geology was actually published at the same time as British were invading Sydney Cove. I think that's really interesting. And so I think that perhaps, Emma, we're seeing not just, as Will's indicated, this really rich conversation across disciplines. In fact, even within history, we're seeing world historians, environmental historians, and historians of science come together over this question.
Can I just add one thing though here? I think one of the interesting things about the history of science, and perhaps because it's maybe a more mature field, but it's very possible to take a critical perspective on science from the history of science, right? Not to take scientists' word for how it goes. And I think that's a really important feature that I value very much in the history of science. But when now this is again, me as an outsider, as a consumer, when I switch into some of the deep history narratives, especially those that have become incredibly popular, you know, I'm thinking about the guns, germs, and steel, and I'm thinking about Homo sapiens, I see a very different appropriation of science that is kind of taking scientists' word for it and not having that critical perspective that I've come to value so much from the history of science. So it's kind of, it's a strange tension for me in thinking about the narratives that one would want to promote publicly as an understanding of the Anthropocene or anything else, whether you take that critical stance or you kind of just take science holus bolus and integrate it into your narrative. So I have a little bit of trouble with the latter, but I'll throw that out there as a bit of last minute provocation.
Thanks, Joan. That's something, I guess, as a historian myself and in my own research and work, that I find is definitely a problematic kind of issue that doesn't go away. I'm not a scientist, and I can read a lot of scientific literature. That still doesn't make me a scientist, and it doesn't give me a scientist's understanding. So at what point am I suspending disbelief and accepting somebody else's facts, what they're suggesting as facts? And it is, I think, a really interesting tension in this kind of, you know, multidisciplinarity or transdisciplinary approach to history. I do want to move on though, because especially in Alison's response just now, she kind of touched on something that is in another question from Julia Hurst. She says, what seems to be very obviously left out is Indigenous people's understandings and comment to the Anthropocene. Where are Indigenous people's voices in this developing theoretical discussion, most importantly connected to nature and culture, which Indigenous people have been storying for a very long time? So I'm personally very interested in this. I'll wait and hold off on offering my own opinions and open that to everyone else for discussion before I say anything myself. Open field.
And adding to that, I was going to thank you, Julia, because you've really brought in a question there that I was hoping to ask in a different way. But Australian deep history does give us a very unique perspective, I think, on this. And of course, that's the Indigenous voices. So can any of you speak more to Julia's question or comment there? What do you see as the potential here in Australia?
If I may just come in really quickly, I want to say that, and hello to Anne McGrath. I want to say that as a historian, someone trained in the history of science, and in a way I've signaled already the significance of Will and Libby Robin's collaboration early in this recent discussion. But for me, and to come to the Indigenous question, I can still remember an Australian Historical Association meeting, I can't remember what year, Anne will remember, Anne put together a panel called, Anne correct me, how do we write the history of, I think it was at that point 40,000 years. Was that a late 90s meeting? And I can remember just Anne's provocation and incitement to incredibly rich discussion at that point, just in the title of her panel, how do we write the history of 40,000 years? And I can remember being excited, being puzzled, not knowing the answer, and in a way being bowled over by the potential of that question. And I understand that in some way, this is the fascinating thing, it's an ordinary question for a lot of Indigenous people. It's an everyday matter. How do we think about the past of 40,000 years? For a historian coming from it from a different angle, it opened up all kinds of possibilities. And for me, put the significance of Australian discussion deeply informed by this large timescale, which not all histories are. For me, it put a really interesting and lively, rich and challenging Australian conversation into a much larger global crossover discussion between scientists and historians. So hello, Anne, and thank you for that exciting provocation.
I think it was 2006. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And it was the Australian Historians Association conference at the Australian National University. And we had the most amazing lot of people. It was curated. It was a workshop. We had John Mulvaney, we had Indigenous historians, John Maynard, Tony Birch, and people coming in from quite different perspectives. And it was very transdisciplinary and trans-Indigenous knowledge focused. And yeah, I think that one of the very rich things that Indigenous Australian storytellers and writers and historians offer is a very different perspective on time. And it's not of time moving forward. It's a very radical understanding of time. And I think that this touches on just what is history doing? What is it addressing? If it is a perspective always from the present, which I think most historians agree, to me that answers that original sin question that Alison introduced about why we put deep history together with the Anthropocene. Because if the Anthropocene is now, well, from the perspective of now, aren't we asking questions that should go further back to the deep past? But I think the fascinating thing about Indigenous Australians is they don't see the deep past as over. They see it as continuous and something in the present. And I think it's those whole different ways of looking at history, not as a march forward or it's moving forward, but as something which is ever present and in a sort of multiverse. I think that, you know, relativity is an interesting theory, but Indigenous theories of knowledge are maybe richer for the future as well.
Beautifully said, Anne. Thank you. I want to ask one last question, and then we're going to have to finish up as it's almost 2 o'clock. But Ehsan Nabavi, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, has a question for Will about the Great Acceleration and the imagery that kind of goes along with that. As it being enrolled into a fear-based narrative, and Ehsan says, literature suggests that using fear is a risky strategy that is likely to lead to reproducing the governance structures at the heart of the Great Acceleration. Do you see any risk about the Great Acceleration in that sense?
Yeah, really good question. When that label came out, which was a group of us meeting at a Dolan conference, which included myself, Paul Crutzen, and John McNeil, but none of us can remember who actually used the term the first time. So we attribute it to a group, but certainly the issue of fear never entered into that conversation. It was just someone looking at the graphs and looking at the shape of the graph, which was obviously very strong acceleration. But interestingly, how people react to the term Great Acceleration is interesting. And one comment I've got from economist colleagues who shall remain nameless is that, oh, this just represents progress of the 20th century. So for them, it's not fear at all. This is what should be happening, because this is how they define progress. We're all wealthier and we're consuming more and all this sort of stuff. And the Great Acceleration is a great thing in their view. So it depends on what lens you got in your eyes, I guess, as to how you view it. Just to finish off, we just viewed it as a descriptor that was a good label for what we saw scientifically. We didn't have any preconceived notion about what reactions it might get. But that's a very interesting comment that I hadn't seen before. And if it does trigger fear, well, that could be a good thing as well, to at least counteract what the economists think it represents.
Excellent. Thank you, Will. And thank you to all of our panelists and guests. It's been an absolute pleasure. It is 2 o'clock and I'm aware that we will be going over time if we go any longer. So I'd like to thank you all for your participation and your thoughts. Thank you for taking the time and investing the intellectual energy into this. Thank you, all of our audience and guests, for your questions and thoughts. And we'll see you again in a month. That is the end of the presentation. Thank you all.
Can I throw in an advertisement, please, Josh?
Oh, yeah, of course, Anne, please.
I'd just like to say that Julia Hurst was one of our PhD students with an earlier project, which was about deepening Australia's historical narratives. And she did some brilliant videos with Indigenous people from the Blue Mountains that she worked with very closely. And so you can look at some of those videos and their take on time on the website, which is called Deepening Histories of Place.
Excellent. Thanks, Anne. On that note, thank you all again for your time. Have a great afternoon.